So welcome everyone, I'm Katie Koullas, CEO of Yellow Ladybugs. In the spirit of reconciliation, Yellow Ladybugs acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Welcome everyone to this panel discussion dedicated to helping autistic girls and gender diverse young people navigate the fraught and complex worlds of healthy relationships, consent and safety. Before going any further, I have a short content note about today's panel. While our aim is to have a discussion that is accessible for autistic teens and young people, parental discretion is recommended and parents, carers in our audience may prefer to watch this panel before deciding whether it is appropriate for their tweens or teens in their care. And topics for discussion today include reference to sexual violence and abuse, references to poor mental health, self-harm and suicide or ideation, discussions about different gender identities, expressions, sexuality and queer culture. So those are the topics that might be covered today, but let's get started as it's a really exciting time to be here to bring together our live audience with three speakers who have so much lived experience, knowledge, or professional expertise to share with us. And a big welcome to all our parents and carers, teachers, and allied health professionals who are looking to support autistic girls and gender diverse individuals. And to all our neurokin who are tuning in, the warmest of welcomes. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the Department of Education and Training Victoria for sponsoring this event, which has allowed us to deliver this important and empowering content for free. Yellow Ladybugs has long been advocating for how important it is that autistic youth, and especially girls and gender diverse autistic young people, have access to appropriately tailored information about consent and healthy boundaries. The statistics around autistic girls and women's individual experience of abuse are so shocking. And while we're not here today to discuss the systemic and societal changes that are needed to change these statistics and to reduce the barriers our community face when they need to seek help, we do want to acknowledge this reality. And we do have links to our submissions that we have created to try and change the system that we will be providing in the chat function for you to access, read and share at a later stage. But today's discussion is all about giving parents and carers and our young people the tools to be proactive. It's about the protective measures we can take to address the particular vulnerabilities that come with being a neurodivergent young person and the positive steps we can take to empower and educate our girls and young people. To share a quote from an autistic woman, she said, "I learned the hard way and I will do anything I can to teach my girls to empower themselves. The thing is, we need good, honest, non-judgmental conversations that make sense to our autistic minds. We need to be taught that our minds work differently, that boundaries are healthy, that we have the right to a healthy sexuality, and we know that not everyone is who they appear to be." Some really powerful words there. And we strongly believe that these topics need open and honest dialogue. And what better way to do this than through lived experience and professional help? Which brings me to introducing finally, after all that talk, our three panelists who are here today to help us guide current and future generations of autistic girls and gender diverse students navigating this world of healthy relationships, consent and safety. Whew, that was a mouthful. Okay, so I am going to now introduce Tess Moodie. Tess is a passionate intersectional advocate focusing on the prevention of family and sexual violence, disability inclusion and LGBTQIA+ rights. Tess is also a proud queer neurodivergent person. And I'm so excited to welcome back Tess Moodie.
Hi everybody, it's great to see you all here today. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks Tess for joining us. I'd like to next introduce you to Louise Mapleston. Louise is a social worker, artist and consent educator and is the founder of Check and Chat, a consent and respectful relationships psychoeducation service. Louise is also working part-time with the Headspace National Youth Mental Health Foundation as a clinical advisor. Welcome, Louise.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm super excited to hear what's going to come up. Keen.
Very keen to have your thoughts here today too, Louise. Thank you so much. And welcome back, Joanne Hatchard, who you may remember from our conference. As a neurodivergent family therapist, Joanne assists parents, carers, and teens understanding what it means to be neurodivergent. In her work, Joanne utilises her Masters of Social Work and life experience as a neurodivergent woman. Welcome, Joanne.
Hi.
You didn't disappoint with your exciting welcome. I love it. Thank you for joining us. And also, hello to everyone in the audience. We've got quite a large number of people joining us today. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to hear from each of our panelists. So let's jump in. So we're going to spend the first half of this hour-long panel with an introductory discussion between our panelists. And the second half of the panelists will be dedicated to answering your questions in the audience. So you're welcome to share your questions and comments in the chat at any point, and I will facilitate the Q&A session in our second half. So let's get into our question. So question one, we would like to start today's discussion by focusing on developing a better understanding of the specific risk factors for autistic girls and gender diverse young people when it comes to navigating relationships, consent and safety. And I've asked our panelists to share their thoughts on why being neurodivergent makes our young people more vulnerable. So Joanne, we might start with you on that one, if you're ready to jump in and answer that first question.
Okay. I actually wrote something about this because I needed to. So I was questioning whether or not I have dealt with my trauma enough to be helpful on this panel, because we don't want to start this relationship in a trauma bonding or anything like that. So it did take me a little bit of distraction and putting it off before I got to the point where it was, yes, I am, because when I undid it all, and Katie's well aware that I'm more than happy to talk about sex, sexual identity, bad relationships, masturbation. I think I got Katie to blush every now and then last panel. But what was holding me back from this panel was, it's not my trauma that I haven't dealt with, it's the shame. And I think what happens in the neurodivergent community is that we get told to be quiet so often, and we get told to be, to put it away, to calm it down, that when there is something that we do need to talk about, we don't have the capacity, we don't know when the right time is. And it is the shame that hangs on to it. So I think this is a beautiful panel for highlighting the fact that shame will have the longer lasting effect than anything else. So how to get around that is to be willing to talk about your own experiences, have really blunt conversations that aren't just alluding to things, be quite frank about what happens around sex, around drugs. Neurodivergent folk tend to have a low tolerance around drugs, so we tend to have a higher reaction, and we also tend to be addictive personality as well. So I made a huge amount of poor choices growing up through self-medicating because I hadn't been diagnosed, and it wasn't really a thing. Neurodivergence wasn't a thing that we talked about. So I'm grateful that this generation, there is so much more clarity around what it means to be neurodivergent, and that younger females and gender diverse people are having that curtain at least taken away so that we can start discussions around what it means to be easy bait, confused around social naivety, understanding that friends can even goad you into poor choices because you know, you think everybody's doing it when in reality nobody's doing it, and they're talking about you behind your back kind of thing. So having open conversations that may be awkward for you as a parent, but finding somebody that, if you're not willing to do it, that somebody can do it for your child. Because I think from personal experience, there was, to be completely gross, I guess, there was a saying going around that, oh, good head as in you're stupid. And mum would tell my brother not to use that. And I asked, well, what does good head mean? And she alluded to the fact that's when you take a penis in your mouth and you try and swallow it, which is really not what happens. But if that's what you're trying to do, then that wasn't a helpful thing for me to have in my mind when I was entering in the world of the sex. So being really open and honest about what the colloquialism and slang words are actually meaning, and highlighting when would be appropriate behavior, etc., like that, when it is appropriate, what point do you get to that point, and it's not, it's not the first thing you do after kissing type of thing. It's, you need to really be quite clear of what the progression is in a relationship as well.
Really interesting, really good point, Joanne. And I think you've explained how important it is to be open and honest, but also being mindful of any terms you might use that we as neurodivergent people might take literally, and those communication differences are really important to be mindful of. We might come back to you after we have a chat to Tess and Louise to finish off this question. Tess, what did you want to talk about regarding the particular vulnerabilities for our community?
Thank you. I just, first of all, want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Pirapa people of Lutruwita down in Tasmania, and just acknowledge and pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Everything what Joanne said was absolutely right, that taking the literal meaning of everything. And like in our household, we're a sex positive household, in that we can just talk about all the things at any time at the kitchen table, and regularly my young neurodivergent young people, children and young people, bring to the kitchen table some expression or colloquialism they've heard, and they're like, Mum, what's that? So we have many kitchen table insights that go on, and many laughs about that. So yeah, that was good to talk about that. For me, I think because many of us have really super strong empathy and we feel deeply and care deeply for people, we mistakenly can assume that everyone else is the same and are going to reciprocate this. We can be really trusting, loyal and forgiving, and often we still try to see that good in people even when they've shown us otherwise, or red flags, or even been plain outright abusive. So that puts us at a bit more risk. Also, because we've always wanted to fit in, not feel different as young people, that may mean that we mask or hide feelings, which can result in us being really compliant and be people pleasers when it comes to relationships, sex and intimacy. And there's language that our peers will use when we're young people, and it sounds something like, if you really like me or love me, you'll have sex with me, or everyone has sex, what's wrong with you? And this type of language can reinforce some of those belief systems. And because what we hear we can take quite literally, we can mistakenly believe if we don't do it, then we might lose that person that we really like, or that we're not normal if we're not doing it. I remember as a teenager, I gave what I would call now coerced consent, because I feared being different or losing a boyfriend or not being normal. And I also mistakenly believed that love was equal to sex. So it was a really skewed view, and I thought that sex was 99% the way that you express love when in a relationship, because nobody had told me any different. So I was, as a young person, really very quick to say yes as the first response to requests to engage in sexual behaviour, which I think was due to, I have slow processing speed, and I felt that pressure to give that answer immediately. So I'd often say yes, but then a short time in think, I really didn't want to do that. But then I'd feel it was really difficult to then speak up that I'd changed my mind. I also, when I was growing up, because I'm old, I'm 47, we didn't have the internet, but we still had access to porn in magazines or, you know, on videotapes. But now with the internet that's readily accessible at fingertips, many of our young neurodivergent people may learn what sex is through watching porn, which a lot of it's hardcore, lacks consent, doesn't have respectful communication, and even has violence in it. And very rarely do you see consent being portrayed as sexy or normal. So in porn, women are depicted as appeasing men, always compliant, ready for sex. And neurodivergent young people who tend to mimic behaviour, may mimic the sexual behaviour or practices that they see in porn. And in reality, you know, if autistic girls or young people, gender diverse people, and in fact young men, are basing their whole concept of sex and relationships on porn without appropriate education alongside, this really makes them more vulnerable to unsafe sex, sexual assault or non-consensual touch. The other, I guess, there's a complex factor in there too, is that compliance or that conditioned compliance can be reinforced by ABA therapy, which teaches compliance but rewards it. So, you know, ABA therapy can teach us that we will receive love, admiration or gratitude if we do what's asked of us. And that's why I think too that when we're thinking of ABA in the context of consent, this can really create a slippery slope that brings some blurred lines if we're then looking at consent over in sex and relationships.
Wow, that's a really good point. And we do talk about that ABA and the consent concern we've got in our submission to the Royal Commission, which was in the link that we'll provide. So all of that was amazing, Tess, and so relatable. Communication differences, different sensory needs, alexithymia, interoception, rejection sensitivity. You spoke about masking, fawning, people pleasing, and the therapy and societal risks are all things that we need to understand, add layers of vulnerability for our particular cohort. So thank you for sharing your experience. Louise, we might jump to you now.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm thinking, gosh, what's left to say? There's always more to say. Hey, so I want to acknowledge that I'm tuning in from the Wurundjeri Bunurong lands here in Melbourne, and I pay respect to any past, present and emerging leaders. Yeah, and I also want to acknowledge I'm not an autistic person, and I feel very privileged to be on this panel and allowing me to take up some space when I know this is absolutely an autistic-led organisation. So just wanted to flag that and just say I'm really grateful to be here. So my role, I run a service where I deliver, so I'm a social worker by background, but I deliver one-to-one consent education, psychoeducation, respectful relationships, sexuality, I guess you'd say counselling, or it's psycho-ed, I guess it depends on what the need is. And I'm coming, I guess, at this from more of like that clinical perspective. So interestingly, the first thing on my list when I had this question, I was like, it said explicit language. So, you know, making quite concrete language. So for example, like I always, with any client, you know, we always talk about what are the proper names of private parts, because culturally and societally, as we've talked here, we tend to talk around sexuality, sex, our bodies. And I think that's embedded into a broader culture of shame, it's complex stuff, but I do think what Joanne was saying before about the shame that many autistic women, and I think a lot of women feel about their bodies, is broadly connected to this idea. It's like, well, you're not even supposed to engage in these concepts, and you're not even supposed to talk about these things. So I get a lot of people coming to my service because, you know, their carer or whoever would be like, hey, I just feel like they're not, my young person has issues saying no, or knowing when they don't feel comfortable, or knowing when or knowing their own boundaries. And I think in terms of my autistic clients, also I wanted to flag here, most of my clients also have an intellectual disability. So I guess coming back to those concepts of interoception, right? And finding it the interoception, it's a bit of a word. I'm sure lots of people know. They'll give you like a bit of a rundown. But this idea of being able to sense your own internal states. So, for example, when we look at body safety education, we always talk about, oh, what's the the feeling of butterflies in your tummy? Maybe when you're feeling a bit nervous or a bit scared or uncomfortable. But we know people with autism, for autistic people, that can be potentially hard to access. And maybe those skills haven't been taught, or they're not encouraged for a range of reasons, or listening to their own internal cues may have in the past not been encouraged. So yeah, I guess a lot of the work I might do with people is around those body safety concepts, and the idea of alexithymia before, like being unable to necessarily match emotion with the bodily state that you're experiencing. So it's hard to say, I feel unsafe, if you're not even sure of what that weird feeling is in your stomach, that most people, say so that neurotypical people might go, that's my signal for feeling anxious or scared or things like that. So yeah, a lot of the work is around that, and that's, I think, we're coming down to the crux of it, sometimes why it's really difficult and makes people, autistic women, quite vulnerable. If we're trying to say, hey, they're trying to assert themselves in situations, but actually, like, gosh, even the first step of recognizing that they're uncomfortable there is kind of missing. So yeah, that can be a bit of work that I do with young people who I'm talking to and working with. So yeah.
Wow, I was nodding my head throughout all of that, Louise, and I love this answer, because a lot of people haven't actually heard of the word interoception. They might have heard of alexithymia or alexithymia. I always pronounce that wrong. And so yeah, that's a really good point, and we've got some great resources that we can share on our socials about this, because I think that this leads on to our next question, actually, and I think I might just keep with you, Louise, because then we'll jump to Joanne and Tess. But what are the most effective ways we can teach and empower neurodivergent young people on the topics of consent and boundaries and healthy relationships? And second to that, what can we do as parents, or what do schools need to know? So we'll go to you first, Louise, then Joanne and Tess.
Sure. Gosh, I could write a thesis on this, right? And I'll try and keep it just to some of my main thoughts around this. So when I at least work with autistic young people, I try and ensure that the information I'm presenting them is rights-based, provides ethical frameworks for them to look at the different situations, relationships, their bodies, and also giving them information about legal frameworks. Well, what are the laws around consent? What are the laws around sexting? And hoping that giving them these rights-based ethical and legal frameworks allows the individual to make choices, giving them that choices about their relationships, their bodies, and the ways that they engage with others. There's some amazing resources out there, and if anyone does want to get in touch afterwards, happy to send through some things I think would be really helpful if you kind of want to talk to your young person about this. But, there's no evidence that says talking to young people will make them go, oh, now I'm going to go out and have all the sex. What we know is all the evidence suggests is that if we empower young people with the information and knowledge, then they can make better and healthier choices for their bodies and their relationships. I'd also be really, again, as we said before, use explicit language. We don't want to talk around. We want to say the word vulva and vagina. It's not a front bottom, not a flowery flower, whatever it is. It's using explicit language to be clear that we are talking about bodies and sex. There's plenty of great books. I can recommend lots of books by Janine Sanders. She's got some amazing books around body safety education. I'm sure there's some other incredible authors. Plenty of great videos online. And also I think the role of parents in this is contextualization. Often in lots of autistic research, they say that sometimes applying information they learned to different contexts can be a bit harder. So I guess it's going, and this is for anyone, but particularly I think for autistic people, it's looking at teachable moments. So sure, you might talk about consent at home and respectful relationships at home, but when you're out in the community, it's going, oh, did you just see how that man talked to his wife? How do you think she feels about that? And kind of contextualizing and using those things you might talk about at the dinner time table and going, well, how does this apply to other relationships outside of the house? And I guess just broadening the scope of these conversations. Yeah, I think that's
really good.
Thanks.
No, really, really good. And we'll maybe grab some of those links to the authors that you suggest and we'll share it with our members. Great. Joanne, we might jump to you next on this question. What ways we can empower parents and teachers to help in this space?
Yes. Before that, I just wanted to add that Tess was around that coerced consent, is that a lot of the time we see marriages break down and the reason was that they weren't having sex, and that is seen as an acceptable reason for infidelity. So there's that layer of social expectation that the sex must happen for a relationship to continue. So yes, thank you very much, Tess, for highlighting that. And that also highlights that trouble saying no, because we can future think so many options, and that kind of puts us in a frozen state, but we know we need to say something. So that's generally a yes, and that gets everything moving along again. With the interception, Louise, I think one of the best things that I have found is from Lisa Fieldman Barrett. She's a neuroscience scientist. There we are. Thank you. And they actually mapped what emotion looks like in the body. So there's a visual representation of what emotions feel like and temperature wise and where you might feel them in the body. I found that has been an amazing starting point for the neurodivergent clients that I have, because when you get that butterflies in the belly, that doesn't really, like, butterflies vibrate. So you get that they're vibrating, but it doesn't give you a real where are they in your belly type of thing. Whereas this picture of heat and where the heat sources are felt are like an amazing way of mapping an emotion to a feeling, which is, I think, where a lot of us have got misunderstanding around what an emotion actually feels like. To correct that mapping is a brilliant starting point, because then we can pull that back in and say, well, what am I actually feeling? So what's that focus on the internal understanding of what you're actually going through or feeling, or what am I actually thinking? I'm a fairly mental person, so I'm a lot of it is just thoughts and trains of thoughts, and I need to, one of the best things that I've done in my relationship is I've allowed that stream of consciousness to come out my mouth. So it's not just me going around in a circle. It's an actual conversation that's happening, and I'm getting feedback that I can correct that information.
So Joanne, what was the name of that document?
Lisa Fieldman Barrett.
All right, we might get one of the admin teams to try and search it and share it in the chat for everyone listening today.
Yes.
That's okay, they can do it. We'll jump back to you answering your question, superstar, Joanne.
Okay. And the other thing around, there's the mechanics of sex, and then there's the emotions and values of sex. I found the joy of sex to be the version of the 80s version. I found that to be the most informative. My parents are a little bit prudish, so they didn't want to talk about it. But The Joy of Sex was one of the most informative books that I have had. But that kind of covered the mechanics of sex, whereas social and emotional, really, I fucked up quite a lot to my own detriment, because once I had an orgasm, that was like stimming for me. That was fucking be all and end all, right? And I would skip through building a relationship to get to that reward, and that was like heaven on earth, right? And then I was done with the person. So I'm the mechanics of sex, great, but understanding more around what it means to actually have an emotional connection, a social connection, the ramifications of what happens when you start to have sex with a lot of people. Like, there is so many different nuances, and understand that stimming for sex, or sex for stimming, there's probably better ways of doing it, because that's a use and abuse of somebody else. So that's not having a healthy relationship with that other person either.
So just getting back, that's really good points, Joanne. So as parents, teachers, what do they need to know about that, being able to explain that, and when should we start explaining that kind of level of detail?
I think probably I was interested in the whole mechanic. Whenever they start to talk, whenever your child comes to you and starts to talk about it, that's when the conversation starts. It's not on your timeline when you're comfortable talking about these things. It's when it comes up. And you don't need to give all of the rules all at once, but you do need to have that this is an open conversation. And if it comes up in the schoolyard, then that's I don't know if it's really the teacher's place to say, we can have that conversation. It's the teacher's place to say, talk to your parents, and the parents provide the information that way. Teachers need to be aware of any of the dirty jokes that are happening, because they do happen, and a neurodivergent person won't understand what they mean and may use them inappropriately, as I did with a joke to my grandfather about chlamydia. I didn't actually understand what I was talking about, but everybody laughed when I told it the first time round. My grandparents didn't think it was as funny, but I still had no idea.
Fair enough. Just quickly, Louise wanted to just jump in quickly just to talk about the age topic while we're on that, and then we'll continue on.
Sure thing. So I guess I just wanted to add to Joanne, like around when's the right time to start talking about these things. And you know, I think we can start actually talking about, you know, consent and bodily autonomy as early as, they say, at age 3. You know, you can actually start talking about this concept. There's lots of wonderful books around that, lots of information around those body safety concepts. And I think, you know, the sex bit, the really explicit sex bit, you know, that can kind of wait probably until upper primary school. But yeah, I think those concepts of consent, of body autonomy, of setting boundaries with others, you can literally begin age 3, and it doesn't have to be sexual as such. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Louise. Just for time, we might jump to Tess, and then we can just all jump in if we've got any other points to add on this question. So Tess, what would you add, how we can actually teach our neurodivergent young ones?
Yeah, the very first hurdle that we have to overcome is that societal assumption that autistic or neurodivergent people, or people with disability, don't want sex or need sex or relationships, or that we don't even think about them. So that also perpetuates assumptions that there's no chance that we could be LGBTIQA+ either. So these assumptions can quite often mean that neurodivergent young people don't receive the education that's required, because it's assumed that they may not need it. And this is particularly the case with young people with intellectual disability too. Also, you know, it can't be assumed that just because your child or young person has attended sex ed in school that they do have a strong grasp about sex, relationships or consent, because the way that schools deliver that content might not suit their style of learning or thinking or understanding. So this is where you as a parent can ensure that they're getting the information that they need and have a proper understanding of it through two-way conversations, because you know your child or young person better than anyone. And that gives you the ability to explore what their understanding is, or correct any misunderstandings they have, or complement that as well. Also, in the sex ed programs, consent is not well covered in a lot of the programs, particularly those that are at faith-based schools that have that strong reproductive focus on sex ed. And most of them are not LGBTIQA+ inclusive, which is important because we know that from research, many of our neurodivergent young people are also trans or gender diverse. So much more work's needed on that from the school-based perspective, but that's where you can fill the gaps as a parent. I think, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, providing resources for your young people, look for resources that are in easy read, plain English format, and preferably they're visual tools as well. So diagrams, images, videos. I would, as a parent, highly recommend, if you are not already on TikTok, you join, because your young person's learning a lot from there, and to be able to talk to them about that is powerful as well. Teaching consent. So this is something I think about lots, and we talk about at the kitchen table. Teaching consent is not just sitting down and teaching consent about relationships or sex. It's teaching it across all different settings, whether that's medical settings, taking and sharing of just everyday photos, non-intimate hugs. That's important. So if we're teaching consent every step of the way and in multiple settings, that our young people have choice and agency over their bodies, then we're really well resourcing them to be able to grasp that concept then when it comes to relationships or sex. Another tool that can be helpful, and I've done this at home too, is role-playing consent conversations in little scripts. So they're already rehearsed and are comfortable in having consent conversations before they're in a situation. Another thing that can be helpful is sitting down with the young person, or just telling them this is something that they can do, because if they're older, they'll think it's embarrassing. But get them to write down a written plan about what forms of touch are okay for them. So it can be a simple list of just, you know, drawing up 3 columns, having a column of what they're 100% okay with in sexual intimacy, things that they're not sure of or open to maybe exploring, but then having a hard no list as well. So for example, they may put hugging's okay on their 100% list, but kissing may be too much, and they put that on their absolute no list, and saving it on their device, so their iPhone or their iPad or their phone, so they can just, you know, pull that up at any time, because that also gives them a visual tool and a practical tool to open up, look at it, or even share with the person that they may be exploring with when they're a young person. And particularly even so if they struggle with verbal communication. And yeah, on that note of non-verbal consent, I think there's ways that we can teach young people to use their body to signal no or signal consent. So things like teaching them that if they're feeling uncomfortable, physically move away or shake their head in a firm no, as much as, you know, they can signal yes by, you know, nodding their head or moving in closer. Also, an obvious one, which we haven't really mentioned yet, is using assistive technology to communicate your yes and your no as well. Like, that's always an option to whip that out in the bedroom. Nobody says that that can't be there as well. So, yeah, that's
a really good point, Tess, because we also have to remember that a lot of our community can get to a point where they're non-verbal in a stressful situation or an unexpected situation. So having that chat before they get to that point is really good, and giving them those strategies. So this question's been really helpful. I don't know about everyone in the audience, if you want to share your comments in the chat, but we heard about explicit teaching on how and why it's so important for our particular neurology, and explaining to our young ones why society makes us more vulnerable, being open about it. Also empowering autistic young people in a way that ensures their rights are respected, the importance of trust and having a safe adult to have an open dialogue with. So if it isn't you, who is it? Is there someone else they can go to? Accessing support through neurodivergent peers or mentor networks is also important. And as Tess just finished off with, how to communicate consent when you're nonverbal. So those were some of my highlights from question 2. We might stick with you, Tess, because we're going to just quickly jump into question 3. And then Joanne and Louise, you're able to add anything from question 2 or 3 you want to add. But how do we discuss these topics with our neurodivergent young people in a way that's, 1, neuro-affirming, but 2, also gender and sexuality affirming? Because we want to give advice to you, parents who are wondering how to help their young people navigate, you know, let's be honest, the complexities of relationships and consent when they are both neurodivergent, they may be queer or gender diverse or questioning these parts of their identities. So, Tess, how would you like to respond to that one?
This is the one that I could write the PhD on. So this was really hard for me to write short answers to, but I'll try and keep it short. As we know, according to the research that we have out there, a higher percentage of autistic people identify as LGBTQ+ than the general population. There's actually one study out there that suggests that the rate is 15 to 35%, which means it's approximately 2 to 3 times higher than the general population. Also, autistic women and girls are more likely to be LGBTQ than men. Now, school sex ed, like I said before, predominantly does not address LGBTQ+ issues unless, you know, you've got some really cool sex ed teacher that's probably already queer and dropping it into the conversation. And I know in my own teen years, because I was undiagnosed, I was late diagnosed, my own undiagnosed autism during that time made it more difficult for me to work out that I was queer and non-binary, because I actually just struggled being in touch with my own feelings and desires anyway, because I was putting all of my energy into social performing, like just navigating the social world. So what happened for me was I just fell in line with the societal expectation of being cisgendered and straight, because that was the easy gig. I had no brain space for reflective thinking about what I really wanted. So I didn't navigate that until a lot later in life, and not fully until after my autism diagnosis. Also, you know, back when I was young, there wasn't the proper education or language to describe what I was feeling, or even a place to have that conversation to explore it or affirm it. So it was very difficult for me to work out. I mean, that's back in the late 80s, but still to this day and age, there may not be places for young people to have those conversations. So it's important to have those open spaces that are non-judgmental. The other risk that there is for autistic young people is having their gender or sexual orientation pathologized by medical professionals. When I was working as an LGBTQ counsellor, I heard many stories of this, unfortunately. So what that looked like is when they reach out to their doctor or even the sexual health clinic saying that they thought that they were queer or trans or gender diverse, it can be dismissed as them not knowing who they are because they're autistic, or their autism causes a confused identity, and that creates a lot of trauma for young people, with some really dire consequences as well. So this is where parents understanding what it means to be LGBTQ and being able to have those conversations, validate it, affirm it, and accept that sexuality and gender diversity is something that we can talk about, and I will support you in that. And in reality, this acceptance or conversations and support from the family is the biggest protector from suicidality for young people who are LGBTQ. A lot of parents will think, I don't know how to talk about this. So the most powerful thing you can do as a parent is educate yourself, so you can help that young person and help them to find appropriate resources. Don't be scared to reach out and get some professional support for both yourself or your young person, but never ever dismiss it, apologise it, judge it, or in the extreme, and this may shock some people because it still happens, but in the extreme you can go down the really trauma-inducing path of conversion therapy, which literally is another form of ABA, and yes, it still happens in Australia. Also prepare yourself that your young person may identify as being asexual. So asexual means that they may not experience any sexual attraction or romantic attraction towards anyone of any gender, or may have a low attraction. So your young person may be totally touch aversive and simply not want to have sex or explore sex or romantic relationships, and be able to normalise that too as another part of the sexuality spectrum. And probably lastly I'll say is that young people may identify as one thing on the LGBTQ spectrum, or even identify as straight, but this can change many times as their journey unfolds, and that's okay too. So they're not locked into whatever they're telling you this month. That could change for them next month. So just educating yourself enough to accept that and just support that, that will really put you in a position where your young person will trust you, and they'll turn to you as the person that they talk to when they're just trying to work that out themselves.
Really good, Tess. Is there any final thoughts on this topic? I know you could go all day.
I could. I found a quote when I was just looking at some of the things that young people who are LGBTQ say about their journey. And I found this really cool quote that I want to share. And what they said was, the intersection between being queer and being autistic is that we don't want to be altered. We don't want to be changed. We don't want to be cured of who we are. And our worth doesn't derive from seeming normal. I thought, oh my God, that quote just says it all.
It says it all, and it's a beautiful segue to go to Joanne, because I'd like to know Joanne's thoughts about neuro-affirming ways that we can talk about this.
Yeah. Yes. I wrote notes. I think what can be really beneficial is understanding that we're all living a human experience, right? So feelings and desires are feelings and desires. Where they're attracted to may alter and may change, but a feeling of wanting to touch someone or something is a feeling of wanting to touch someone or something. And it doesn't matter where it's based from or where it's going out to, that lowest common denominator is true for all. What changes is perhaps your ability to talk about it, or feeling safe enough to talk about it, or if there's shame to talk about it, or if there's the confusion. What I would recommend is using your own personal experiences, because showing your embarrassment state, you don't need to be an expert in any of the fields to start a conversation. Sharing the embarrassing things that happen throughout puberty and the exploration of this area is hugely beneficial, because I haven't met one person that hasn't done something just back-ass stupid and embarrassing in this arena, because hormones and sexual desire and all of that stuff is so very confusing, and you know, I got it wrong quite a lot. So I have a lot of embarrassing stories that I could share. But I think, Tess, you're 100% right in regards to showing consent in all settings. And that means parent can be modeling by knocking on the door and waiting for a response rather than knocking and entering. Like if you're going into their bedroom, while they're on the toilet, in their, I have to remind my son to get off the toilet, which is why that one came up. Getting out the shower. Non-verbal consent, using basic sign language, learn that so it comes at a time of when you are stressed, that will be a reaction that happens. Understanding your own basic body language, and then your ability to interpret that in somebody else, so you can see that somebody is pulling away. And I can't imagine the layer of bravery would have to be to go in for a first kiss in a non-typical, like a not male-female relationship. So knowing that you can lean in, but you don't go all the way, and wait for them to consent to lean into you. I think it was in a Hitch movie. You go in and you leave 10% and wait for that person to bring their 10% to you. Like little rules like that, I think help. And it doesn't matter what kind of relationship that is, because there is a level of bravery that has to happen for you to put yourself out there. And that is compounded when the relationship isn't in a male-female stereotypical way.
All very good points. I like that. We've got so many questions, but we're going to quickly jump to Louise to finish on this question, and then we'll jump to some questions.
Thanks, Katie. Tess, when you said the stats around that, we know like the queer neurodiversity is like potentially 30% up or higher. I was like, oh, literally, I was counting the other day. I was like, I think like 30 to 40% of my caseload is queer, and I was just going, what? This is, and I'm a queer person as well, and I know often, you know, the queers love the other queers, and we have a little bit of a bond around that. But gosh, this makes a lot of sense, and it validates what I was thinking. So for most, as I said before, most of my clients also have an intellectual disability as well as being autistic. And often the parents will come to me and they'll be like, this is just another complexity on top of just layers of complexity. How do I even, on top of everything else? These parents are trying their best, right? We all are. So wonderful resources that I use with a lot of the young people that come through my doors, and we start to explore what is sexuality and their own sexuality, is Sexual Health Victoria have amazing like social stories and easy read guides of what it is to be gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, you name it, like it's all there. So they've got like wonderful resources on that, as well as a family planning in New South Wales as well. They've got some wonderful resources. That could be, you know, something that you could, if they say, oh, I'm not quite sure, I like boys and I like girls, and or everything in between, you know, you can say, well, this is what it means. Even if you are a straight person, you know, like you can still kind of find that language. And even if you're not, you're like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, you know, follow what it says. You know, these resources are there for a reason. And I guess I just wanted to say that, you know, the young person will lead you. And, you know, if the young person says, I don't think I'm straight, like they're probably not straight. Yeah, in whatever way that is. And, you know, I've had parents ask me, oh, just teach them just about the men and the women relationships, you know, that just keep it at that. And it's like, oh, well, they're not interested. And, you know, I use a lot of dolls and things in my work with people, and they're like, oh no, please bring the other Ken doll. And you're like, all right. Like, it's like, well, the young person's leading this, you know. And so I think it's like, I guess, believe them, validate them. And there's wonderful, lots of young, like LGBTI youth services. So for example, like Minus 18, they have some incredible resources on the website, meetup groups. Lots of local councils have young queer nights and evenings. Look into it. There's some really cool stuff out there for them to connect.
That's really cool, Louise. Thank you, because we are doing another panel potentially with Minus 18 for our community. So please stay tuned, everyone watching. So we are going to jump into some questions because there are so many. Now, oops, let me check if I've done the technology right on this. So we've got a few questions on risky practices as teenagers to fit in. We've got one question that says, I've had a lot of issues with risky practices as a teenager to fit in myself, with grooming, sexual coercion, domestic violence, and I'm terrified my daughter will go through the same, because I personally still don't really understand how to set boundaries or have healthy relationships, even though I'm 36. How do I help her when I don't necessarily understand it myself? It really worries me. I'd love some advice from the panel. And there was another question asking about their niece involved in risky sexual practices and wanting help as well. So who wants to jump in on that question first? Anyone? Joanne?
Hi. So from some lived experience, also from some education and from conversations. And I think specifically when you can say, I'm not entirely sure on how to create boundaries myself, that is the perfect place to start the conversation.
So
because it shows you're not the master, you're not the dominator, you're not the leader, you're the explorer, same with them. And mistakes are made and you learn from your mistakes. So keep that in mind as well. The risky behavior could be happening because it feels good. So find other ways of stimming. There could be social coercion. It's it is really about a conversation. And if they don't want to have it with you, then find a social worker, a counsellor, anybody that they can talk to, a peer mentor, somebody that they can have a conversation with.
That's a really good point. Thank you. Tess, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit, and it comes back to something I said before about watching porn and learning from porn, which quite often depicts risky behaviours. I just wanted to mention that. I will be truly transparent and say that I was a teenager that engaged in every risky sexual practice that there ever was. So like you, Joanne, I learnt from experience and stuffing up, and so many, I get cases of, sexual assault like I was in situations where, it was risky and I couldn't read the room, and then that's what happened for me. So yeah, there's a lot of concern as a parent about your young person that what could happen to them. But again, acknowledging sometimes, like I think one of the questions said that that was someone who'd also had that experience and they don't know what to do. I think sometimes when you sit down with the young people and have a conversation that says, when I was young, and usually when I have that conversation, I say, I don't mean to sound like an old boomer, but when I was young, this was my experience. And I really would like to talk to you about that because, I learned some things that took me a lot of hard knocks to learn. And can we have a chat about it? Something I think can be helpful too is, instead of making it sound like you're the parent authority figure sitting there telling them what they should and shouldn't be doing, I try and shift the conversation round into like a brainstorming conversation. And quite often I will use the language of, hey, your friends at school, what sort of things are they doing? Like, what do you hear about that they do? And can we have a chat about that? Because I really want to have an understanding of what you think about, is that risky or is that not? So I sort of make it a collaborative, invitational discussion instead of saying, I think you're doing some risky things. Now let's have a big yarn about that because I'm worried. So I shifted away from them, and it seems to create a more comfortable space as well. Yeah.
And also highlighting the fact that you can say no at any point. Naked, bits hatching, touching, you can turn around and say, no, I've changed my mind, I'm done. And feel secure enough that somebody will come get you, or you can leave, and that is an okay choice to make. You don't have to be there just because you said yes when you thought it was going to be okay.
Yeah, and absolutely. And there's a little conversation to be had around, are you doing those things because you think you have to, or you think that that's what we need to do for sex? Or when you do those things, does it feel good? Do you enjoy it? Those sort of conversations too. I mean, you'll have the young person say, oh, Mum, I don't want to talk about that. Quite often they'll navigate back to it sometime later, even if it's not in that initial convo. Yeah.
And can I just say here, this is why it's so good at the earliest age to start helping our young ones understand how they feel, that interoception, that, oh, sorry guys, sorry, my daughter's just doing Find My iPhone for me. This is why it's so important to do interoceptive skills, to know how you're feeling, because it's all linked in, because they might be in that situation but still just going along with it because they don't actually know how they're feeling. And this is what we can do from a young age. I wish I was taught that. I wish I taught my kids that from a really young age. And even if it's mindfulness or yoga, or to begin understanding that brain-body connection, it's really helpful. Thank you, Tess. Did you have anything to add, Louise, as well to that? Because there's a few more questions coming through.
I just wanted to add, so I work from a harm-in perspective, and, I do think it's important to talk to them, and this is really obvious, I know, but actually talk to them, are you using contraception? Behaviour changes takes a really long time, right? And there's complex issues why, but is it the conversation that you go, all right, I understand you're engaging in these behaviours. That's what's going on right now. But maybe we should actually also just have a chat to GP around making sure that at least you're not going to get pregnant, or hopefully not STIs or STDs, or even if it's just talking about, you know, have you had a check? Like, it's free, you can go to the GP. If you're over 16, you get it done yourself, or I can help you. Because this behaviour change strategy is long term, but for that time being, like, you know, we can probably prevent some harm in that way of health. And that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah. Or
Yes,
you can
sorry.
be like me and just buy condoms in the groceries and put them in the bedroom. Whether they want them or not, they're there. We don't even have to have that conversation.
Well, that's a good point. Having that visual reminder there, because those of us who are ADHD have object permanence. I think the word is issues of, if it's not in our sight, it's not in our mind sometimes. So good point. It's 1 o'clock, so those who do need to leave, feel free to leave, but we might go for another 5 or so minutes if that's okay, because we've got so many questions. We might just group some. So someone said, I'm concerned about my 15-year-old people pleasing. It seems so intrinsic that they worry that she'll be coerced into doing things she doesn't want to do just to keep the other person happy. We hear that so much because obviously being rejected socially so often for our community. And again, how to assert those healthy boundaries around that. Who wants to sort of, the question is, have you got any tips that you can support her if she's automatically drawn to giving herself to others?
My tip would be to, now this might sound a little bit ass backwards, but it's to find an activity that they are happy to do by themselves, so that when there is that social pressure to go along with something or to people please, often the fear is that they'll be left alone. If you can find an activity where being left alone is okay, then they have an out. There is it's okay to be by myself. And what I have found is that people are drawn into your circle rather than being adopted into friendship groups, which tend to, I don't know about everyone else, but I tended to be adopted and then here, you like this boy, go out with this boy kind of thing. So it was, I was adopted by a friendship group and then kind of patsied around. If I had an activity that I was comfortable with doing by myself in public, then it would have been me creating my space and people coming into my circle rather than me pandering to the needs of others in order to create a friendship.
Yep, that's really good. That was a really good answer. If no one else has anything else to add to that, I just wanted to jump to another question. Any tips for helping a teenage girl distinguish between romantic interest in someone versus friendship interest?
This is my domain. I can do a lot of activities around this. So, you know, a wonderful place to start is thinking about, you know, doing some brainstorming with them, being like, so what are the qualities of a friend? What are the qualities of friends that you have experienced, or what has made this friend special? What are the activities that you do with this friend? We can do the who, what, why, when, where, using that kind of questioning around that. So really getting them to have a really clear idea of like, what is a friendship? Then we might also go, well, you know, and if you're talking to teens who maybe haven't had any romantic experience, like maybe they haven't had a boyfriend or a girlfriend yet. So they're like, I don't know. So you can look at and deconstruct, well, on the TV, what are some relationships you see around you? Like, is it the ones that maybe it's with the parents? Is it aunts and uncles? Is it, gosh, anyone else that kind of exists around them? And what makes that relationship a bit different to a friendship? I think it's really helpful also to look at, we think about the steps to a relationship. I know Joanne was talking about this before, but you know, so before you might just meet someone, you think they're really great, but we know that that person they're not going to become your boyfriend or girlfriend straight away. So what kind of things need to happen before it gets to that point of a, say, romantic or a sexual relationship, and looking at those stages of relationships and how it might develop or how it might not develop. So yeah, that's
okay, great.
I think that Louise has got a beautiful point there around a crush versus an actual potential relationship or friendship, because a crush becomes an obsession, but you may not have actually spoken to them. You are basing your attraction on their looks, but not actually on their personality. So I think that's a really easy difference to highlight, is that when you have a crush on somebody, they're kind of an idol and they're out of touch, out of reach, versus a friendship that can develop into a relationship that you've actually had a conversation with them is a good start.
Really good point. Did anyone want to add anything more before I ask a very quick yes or no question? Not yet, Tess?
I would just add a little bit there of, this is an interesting question because it's got a very black and white context to it. Like, this is your friends, this is the people that you're romantic or you have relationships with. And I've had conversations again at my kitchen table. My poor kitchen table knows all the stories around this. And the conversations that we've had have been around, you know, how do I know if that's someone that I might want to be my boyfriend? And when we talk about it, I say, you probably just can't know that yet. Like, in black and white thinking terms, you're not going to have that answer. And the only way you're going to work it out is explore it, like to see where it goes to, and then talk to me about it as the little things are happening. So, because it's a human experience and we can't textbook it, and it's very hard to say that to our young people who are very black and white in the thinking and want all the answers too. So yeah, I just sort of say, well, let's keep talking about this and we'll explore it and talk about it together. And I draw on a lot of my own experience around that too, including across my lifespan of thinking someone who was a friend might be a romantic interest and eternally stuffing that up as well. So they're good conversations.
Really good point.
Yeah,
I love that idea, and I think, you know, it might even not be, for those who aren't sort of kitchen table people, it can be even through social media, through texting or sending random images to start that conversation, or memes that might mean something to you. Now, we are running out of time. This is a yes or no answer, which is going to be hard to do. Trust and respecting privacy. Is it okay for parents to check their autistic teens' social media accounts? Yes or no?
Yes, with permission, like not hiding the fact that they did it.
Okay. Louise?
I'm not a parent. I'm actually going to abstain from this question.
Okay. Yes.
oh gosh, we have these discussions all the time, but when I agreed to letting my young people join social media, it was on the condition that at any time, if I thought there was something that I needed to check, that I could. So they've given me that agreement, but I've never actually physically done it. It's always been talking about things that are happening for them on social media for me to teach them boundaries they can lay down themselves for people that are not, you know, being kind or trying to be exploitive. Or so I'm a big believer of not gatekeeping the social media, but educating them enough that they're able to pick up on red flags and be comfortable to come and chat to you about that. Because I think we cross a blurred line then if we're trying to teach them consent and you have your own choices and your agency, and then we're like, well, we'll just come in any time and breach that trust and privacy as well. So it's
very
a hard
good
question.
Point.
It's not a yes and a no. I don't have a yes.
I know. That was a very
I've just done it.
Yep. No,
Yeah.
good point. And I think for me, we had another panel where we heard from young people who all said no, because what it does is it does damage the relationship long term and close those doors. But like Joanne said, and Tess, if you've got agreement beforehand, I think that sounds like that's the way to go. The question is when they don't give you agreement, and I've been down that road, and there has been dangerous coercion going on different social media platforms. And I do want to say to parents listening, make sure you are across all the different platforms, because there's I can't even, like, there's obviously Snapchat where the conversations get hidden, and there is there's a lot of dangerous sites. So it's about working together with your child and keeping those communication lines open, because it is dangerous. It can be, but it can also be a great source of connection, which we heard from our teens when we spoke to them as well. So unfortunately, we've run out of time today. I will say that we've got 2 more panels coming up. One's on gender and one's on sexuality specifically for our community. So we're going to do a deep dive into those specific ones. But today has been all about healthy boundaries and understanding our particular vulnerabilities as a community and cohort. We will keep trying to fight the system at Yellow Ladybugs on a bigger picture level. But we're so grateful for our participants coming in and speaking from their lived and professional experience today. Thank you, Tess, so much for joining us today.
Couldn't find my unmute then.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, thank you everyone that come along. I love these conversations, consent and boundary conversations.
Very important.
So great that this space is happening today.
Thanks, Tess. And Louise, thank you for joining us with your professional hat on today.
Thanks.
Really awesome.
Thank you for having me.
And Joanne, always a pleasure and a hoot to hear you talk. And again, I'm sure we'll cross paths again in a future panel one day.
Thank you very much, Louise and Tess and Katie, because I know how much of a difference this conversation would have made for my life. And so I'm very grateful that it's out there and that the people are willing to have that conversation.
And I'm really grateful for all of you sharing those experiences. I feel like we've just touched the tip of the iceberg, but at least we're going to have the conversations to begin sharing that. When this goes onto our socials, hopefully we can continue that, share more details, share your links to each of your individual organizations as well. And thank you to the audience, because those questions were amazing. What I'd love you all to do though is share this once it goes live, because the more people that can be across this content, the better the future is for our community. So thank you so much for coming along today, everyone. And thank you to all the help behind the scenes, to Natasha, Emma, Courtney, and just the awesome Yellow Ladybugs team for pulling out the background stuff. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you had a good time listening today. I'm just going to end the session now. Bye.